Almost skimming over the treetops, they slipped silently into Russian-controlled Donetsk. Their target was Sever-Akhmet, an important Russian center for drone training and production. Then at 0619 hours local time, the commander of the S-400 battery noticed something unusual on the radar screen. Not a clear formation, not large targets that could be locked and engaged immediately. Only a few strange, faint, broken signal streaks appearing and disappearing inside the ground clutter. But for someone who had sat in front of radar long enough, that was not a system error. Something was moving inside the dead zone of Russian air defense. And only a few seconds later, those faint streaks began turning into a real attack. The S-400 radar is one of the most powerful all-seeing eye layers in Russia's air defense network. The 91N6E Big Bird station can scan the sky out to 350 miles. But what appeared on the screen at that moment was not something the combat crew wanted to see. This was not a fighter jet, not a large missile. These were FP-1 Firepoint drones with radar reflection signatures 70 times smaller than what the radar had been designed to track. On the 92N6E screen, 18 signal streaks appeared and disappeared. They were not clear enough to lock and fire on immediately, but they also did not vanish completely. The battery commander leaned closer to the screen. Those streaks of light did not move like birds. They did not look like weather clutter. They advanced steadily, slowly, low, with a strange rhythm in the radar return, a small regular vibration like the trace of piston engines and propellers tearing through the air at high speed. That was the moment he understood this was not a system error. This was a UAV swarm crawling into the S-400's dead zone. The distance was only 15 miles for the 48N6E3 missile. That was a perfect launch range. From the moment it left the launch tube, the missile could close the distance in only 9 seconds. The order to fire was given. A missile shot out of the launcher, raising a white column of fire, then accelerated to Mach 6.5 before turning toward the faint signal streaks crawling close to the ground. But at an altitude of 150 feet, physics began working against the S-400. Each radar pulse did not only touch the UAV. It also bounced down onto the ground, reflected off metal roofs, power lines, abandoned vehicles, and the terrain below. On the screen, the real target and its reflected shadow overlapped like two images in a cracked mirror. The missile saw more than one target, one real streak, one false streak, one weak signal in the right position, one stronger signal amplified by ground reflection. The guidance computer had only 0.3 seconds to choose, but the system chose wrong. The first missile slammed into an open patch of ground ahead of the UAV formation, exploded, and tore a large crater into the surface. The shock wave swept across the area, but the fire points were no longer there. They cut their engines for 4 seconds, dropped even lower, and let inertia pull them through the clutter layer like ghosts slipping out of radar sight. Inside the control room, the S-400 commander stared in silence as the $4 million missile rushed into the interception point and turned into a meaningless ring of light. Then an unexpected signal flared up. The third UAV suddenly climbed to 1,500 feet, its engine at full power, exposing its entire body and wings to the gravestone. Radar. It turned itself into the clearest target in the sky. The S-400 crew immediately shifted luck. The next 48N6E3 missile was launched. The missile rushed straight into the target. A fireball bloomed in the lower air layer. The third UAV disappeared from the screen, but the Russians did not know that this was exactly what Ukraine wanted. While the S-400 focused on the target that had just climbed, the remaining 17 drones restarted their engines. Within 3 seconds, the small roar of piston engines returned as 17 black shadows dispersed formation at an altitude of about 150 feet. They were no longer flying in a line. They spread across a 9 m wide front, and the distance was now 12 miles. The commander clenched his jaw as the signal streaks began dissolving into ground clutter. Behind him, the system was still trying to rebuild the battlefield picture, but the UAV swarm had passed the first interception layer. They had traded one teammate, 1,500 feet of altitude, and a few dangerous seconds to punch through the first defensive ring. Sacrifice. The 9 M96E missiles rushed toward the interception zone, but the real signal had shifted and most of the formation was no longer there. The proximity fuses found only interference, reflected shadows, and empty space. A salvo of 60-pound warheads exploded in the air, scattering fragments down onto the hillsides, lining waste fields and empty steppe below. Meanwhile, the 15 remaining FP-1s had received what they needed. The coordinates were corrected. INS error was pulled back to an acceptable level. The formation was synchronized again. They transmitted nothing more. Behind them, the two leading UAVs continued pulling attention toward the southwest until one final 9 M96E caught one of them. A flash of fire lit up the low sky. One more FP-1 was torn from the formation, but that price had been calculated in advance. Pole 21 had forced the UAV swarm to go blind for several minutes. S-350 had shot down 2 targets, but in 2 seconds of sacrifice, the 2 leading drones had given eyes back to the remaining 15. And now they continued rushing south, lower than radar, quieter than before, and more accurate than the Russians had hoped. They thought they had disappeared. After Pole 21, the FP-1s believed they could glide through the electronic darkness. But they did not know that 10 miles away, another system had already been tracking them for the past 5 minutes. It was not an ordinary air defense radar. It was the 1L260 ZUP Park 1M, a counter-battery reconnaissance radar system designed to locate artillery shells, rockets, and missiles the moment they fly through the air. But in the low airspace around Horvka, ZUP Park was being used for another mission. Hunting small, low targets that appeared too briefly for air defense radar to lock onto firmly. At 0519 hours local time, the 15 FP-1s entered the Holivka area like ghosts. They dropped to only 90 feet, throttled down their engines to save fuel, and held a steady speed of 120 miles per hour. They had passed the S-400. They had survived Pole 21. They had made S-350 fire at decoys, and now they believed they were beneath the main field of view of Russian air defense. That was why the first launch was so shocking. A 9 M317M missile suddenly left a Buck M3 launcher from a concealed area behind the industrial edge. No clear warning, no prolonged lock signal, only a streak of fire rising from the ground and rushing straight toward the UAV formation. Within seconds, the drones understood the most frightening thing. Somehow, the Russians still knew where they were. Zupark had seen them earlier. The 1L260 radar represented a completely different detection method. It did not need a battlefield-wide air picture. It scanned narrow areas looking for small objects moving quickly across complex terrain background. With artillery shells, it only needed a few points on the trajectory to calculate the firing battery's position backward. With low-flying UAVs, the dangerous principle was similar. If it captured enough movement traces across several consecutive sweeps, the computer could reconstruct the flight direction, speed, and the point where the target would appear next. The 15 FP-1s were flying low through the Horlivka industrial area between spoil heaps, workshops, power lines, and gray earth slopes. Each one left only a small radar return, but their formation had a pattern. 500 yards apart, same speed, same eastward heading, same unusually low altitude. To ordinary radar, that might have been only clutter. To ZUP Park, it was a motion path that could be calculated. After 5 minutes of tracking, the system had enough data. Speed around 60 yards per second. Altitude below 90 feet stable. Movement direction. The predicted intersection point was sent to the Buck M3 battery waiting on the rear line. The Buck M3 commander had 2 choices. Turn on the 9S-36 radar to hold the targets longer and risk exposing his own position, or trust the target designation data from Zupark. Switch on the radar for the shortest possible time, launch the missile, and immediately switch status. He chose the second option. In 10 short seconds, the Buk M3 radar switched on, received the coordinates, locked the target area, and launched. The 9M317M missile accelerated to Mach 4 through the low air layer, rushing toward the pre-calculated interception point. The FP-1S were still flying in silence, but this time, silence no longer protected them completely. They had passed the systems that could see the farthest. But in Horvka, the thing hunting them did not need to see far. It only needed to look at the right place at the right time. 1 minute later, the next missile left the Buk Mach 4.5 through the low air layer, rushing toward the interception point Zupark had calculated in advance. During the first 11 seconds, it left almost no clear warning for the FP-1 formation. No radio signal from the UAVs, no prolonged active radar lock, only a streak of fire closing the distance at terrifying speed. During those 11 seconds, the 15 UAVs were calculated in advance. During the first 11 seconds, it left almost no clear warning for the FP-1 formation. No radio signal from the UAVs, no prolonged active radar lock, only a streak of fire closing the distance at terrifying speed. During those 11 seconds, the 15 UAVs were still flying in electronic silence. The warning receiver showed nothing clear enough to react to. The first warning did not come from a screen, but from sound the roar of the missile growing louder behind them. Then when it was about 1 mile from the predicted interception point, the missile seeker switched on to complete the final phase. They had only 2 seconds. At nearly 120 miles per hour, 2 seconds meant more than 120 yards. The operator of the leading UAV immediately pulled the aircraft into a sharp course change. The engine increased power and the composite frame shook under the overload. The wings bent, the fuselage hissed through the low air. Just a little more force and it could snap like a dry branch. The proximity fuse activated at a distance of 60 feet. The warhead was designed to tear apart flying targets much larger than an FP-1. A cloud of fragments opened like a steel net in the air. The leading UAV was torn apart by 3,500 tungsten blocks launched in a precisely calculated pattern, but its death warned the remaining drones. The next missile was launched 4 seconds later, but by then the FP-1 formation was no longer flying in a steady rhythm. They spread out, constantly changing altitude, sometimes dropping to 70 feet, sometimes rising to 120 feet, sometimes reducing throttle to 40%, then increasing back to 100%, then falling to 80% and 30%. For Zupark, the once clear motion path began to break apart. Stable calculated tracks turned into scattered points difficult to predict. Buk M3 continued firing. One missile activated its seeker too early at 2.5 miles from the formation, instead of waiting until about 1 mile. Just a few extra seconds of warning were enough to change the outcome. 7 FP-1S immediately plunged close to the ground, only 10 feet above the tree canopies and hillsides. At that altitude, the ground became a giant wall of interference. The real target reflected shadows and terrain background blended together. The missile could not hold a clean solution. It exploded above the formation, scattering fragments into empty space instead of tearing into the UAV bodies. But not every drone was lucky. One of them fell behind after the chaotic throttle changes. It lost a few seconds regaining speed, and those few seconds were too many. A 9M317M caught up from behind. The explosion flashed low against the Harifa sky and another FP-1 disappeared from the formation. Now only 13 remained. Stealth no longer mattered. The Russians knew the area they were flying through. Zupark had pointed the way. Buk M3 had begun the hunt. The only choice left was speed. Every second that passed carried them more than 120 yards farther east. Every second survived was one step closer to sever Akhmet. The calculation became cold to the point of brutality. No need to disappear anymore. Just reach the target before the next air defense layer could lock the sky shut. Around the complex, 20 FPV Hunter drones were launched. They were not used for reconnaissance but built for one mission only, rammed straight into the FP-1S. With auxiliary wings to increase lift and a speed of 130 miles per hour, they only needed to hit a wing fuselage or propeller assembly to pull a larger UAV out of the sky. The Russian soldiers at Sever Akhmet reacted very quickly. The first 3 FPVs cut across the Ukrainian formation from the flank. As the FP-1S were flying at an altitude of 120 feet, the first slammed into the left wing of an FP-1. The second rushed straight into the rear propeller assembly. The third struck the lower fuselage, causing the control system to lose stability. In less than 40 seconds, 3 FP-1S were pulled out of formation and fell into the hillside area outside the industrial zone. But the Ukrainian control crews did not panic. They had prepared for this kind of interception after years of observing Russian drone tactics. The surprise lay in the very limits of the Russian FPVs. Although the FPV Hunter drones could reach about 130 mph, they were still limited by batteries with a real flight time of only 10 to 15 minutes. Meanwhile, the FP-1 used a 2-cylinder internal combustion engine, allowing it to maintain high cruising speed for a long time, and fly extremely low through dry river beds, gullies, steppe, and abandoned industrial strips. The Ukrainian crew immediately exploited that weakness. Instead of rushing straight into Severat, the FP-1S pulled the formation into a wide arc, forcing the Russian FPVs to chase them. On the screen, it looked like a mistake, but in reality, it was a trap to burn through the batteries of the pursuers. The Russian FPVs accelerated to maximum speed. One caught up with the last target in the formation, an FP-1 deliberately holding a straight flight path, 1 beat slow.